Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be posing the question, has our government given up on Brexit? As we see news reports coming out that Britain mulls over the idea of having a Swiss-style relationship with the European Union, and so that effectively means closer ties with the EU, which has caused huge political debates regarding our government's commitment to Brexit. So to join me in this week's programme, I'm joined by Pastor Regan King, and together with Alistair Scott, the UK Director for Joseph Storehouse. So welcome to the programme. I'll start off with you, Alistair, because there has been such a battle for Brexit over the last couple of years. It took Boris Johnson to call for a general election in 2019 to give the British government the mandate to get Brexit over the line. And ever since we had that historic referendum on our relationship with the EU back in 2016, this has been a massive battle. Now, according to news reports of this week, particularly the Sunday Times, saying how senior government figures are planning to put Britain on the path to a Swiss-style relationship with the EU. In other words, they're not advocating membership or re-membership of the European Union, but closer ties, pretty much on the Swiss model. Isn't this effectively mean that our government, if it goes ahead and does this, is actually giving up on the idea of Brexit and British independence?
Yeah, it does look that way, doesn't it? Because it's been a battle ever since the original referendum, and there was several years before the actual event came to a supposed close. But I think there's so many people within the parties, and not just Conservatives, right across the governmental table there, that are so pro Brexit. It's funny, I was at a meeting just a couple of weeks ago where I was talking to a Christian, and this lady was so anti-Brexit, and I thought, wow, as a believer I was quite surprised. But I guess we have that right in the church too, saying, I knew it was going to be terrible for England. I told my grandchildren that they were going to be poorer and so on, and I thought, that's a really sad way of looking at it. The main reason for coming out of the European control was because there were so many laws. We were being controlled by people who were not even elected. I mean, I've worked in the EU Parliament, and as you have, several times. So seeing that battle, but the battle I knew was not over just because we'd crossed the line, because you knew there was going to be a counterattack, and then this whole attack on our government of recent weeks, is just putting the pressure back on, because the government needs a way out. And even the war in the Russian-Ukrainian war has put more pressure on our nation to be part of a bigger unit. I mean, we're part of NATO. I know that's a huge unit anyway, but the pressure is back on. And I think, yes, there's no doubt that the present signs are that our government is going to slowly go back to potentially another referendum and maybe going back in, because we've got a younger generation now who are voting too, so the pressure is there. And I think as believers, we need to be praying. We need to be praying because we believe it's right. It's a God event that God led us to that point, because also it gives us that opportunity to work independently of the controlling European Union regarding Israel and regarding any other nation. But we have to pray that our government get things right anyway, otherwise we get into a controlling government situation internally rather than externally.
Absolutely. And Regan, great you can join us on Politics Today. I'm just going to read out this particular paragraph here in the Sunday Times of this week. It says, last week, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, signalled that Downing Street intended to break from the approach of Boris Johnson and remove the majority of trade barriers with the bloc. In private, senior government sources have suggested that pursuing such a fractionless trade requires moving to a Swiss-style relationship over the next decade. However, they insist they would not extend to return to freedom of movement. And our just final quote is, it's obviously something that the EU would never offer us up front, because they would say, you are trying to have your cake and eat it. But the reason I think we will get it is that it's overwhelmingly in the business interests of both sides. So clearly we have with our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who supported Remain. He's a pro-Remainer. We see that Rishi Sunak is a globalist. And do you think this could be our way back in to joining the EU by having a Swiss model relationship the European Union. That means we would contribute to the EU budget. We would adopt the same policies on migration. We would be under which we are now, the European Court of Human Rights as well, which is...
It's interesting, Simon. In one way, it doesn't feel like much has been accomplished by Brexit at all, does it? In terms of migration, has that really changed significantly? I don't think so. In terms of trade, we've had situations wherein it's been great to see opening up trade with other nations that previously it was much more difficult to. I mean, I always used to be a bit confused. We had closer trade relationships with EU nations than we did with Commonwealth nations, and so that made absolutely no sense. So it's been great to see some restoration of a trade relationship with some of those Commonwealth nations and others beyond the Commonwealth as well. A great deal more freedom achieved through that. I'm of course supportive of the notion and idea of a good trade relationship with various EU member states. I think that could be good for our economy. It can keep costs down as we currently have this cost of living crisis. At the same time, when you start to talk about a Swiss-style relationship with the EU, you then begin to have this kind of salami slice-like approach where, okay, we're going to open up trade in this way. Then, even though they're insisting it won't extend to migration, in one way, freedom of movement across the EU, you can see that happening. And then we're essentially in the EU in everything but name, and then, as you already mentioned, Alistair, that it's potential we'll have another referendum. I think that's only a matter of time. Scotland has always been opposed to Brexit, and increasingly we're seeing within the United Kingdom the relationships fractured. Northern Ireland has not been happy with how we've dealt with Brexit, understandably. There's been a lot of confusion in how various policies have been presented, and in Northern Ireland attached geographically to a landmass that is associated with the EU makes that complicated. But we're in a day and time where I think we've had some very poor representation of what Brexit really was meant to be about, and that has meant that maybe some of those who supported the idea of Brexit are growing cold on it themselves.
And that's the danger, isn't it? That we saw with our previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, felt that Brexit offered us a wonderful kind of opportunity to reevaluate our relationship with other nations around the world, with new trading partners, to be free of European interference and European control, that we would have the right to set our own foreign policy, our own domestic policy, our own tax policy, and actually become a nation state. But isn't it a great danger now that back in 2020 at the 2021 G7 summit in Cornwall, we saw that Boris Johnson signed up to a whole number of globalist agendas, and effectively it would seem that Brexit is only existing in name, as we might not be in the EU, but we are certainly being governed by a globalist Prime Minister with globalist ideas, and that the concept of the nation state as being sovereign and independent is maybe a thing of the past.
It certainly seems that way, isn't it? And it does seem like Reagan was just saying, it's a step-by-step move, isn't it? And the old story about how do you boil a frog? Put him in cold water and turn the heat up. And I think this is like the first step towards this globalist movement. And we know the pressure is not only on UK, but the pressure will be right across Europe as well. But the frightening thing is that the majority of the leaders of the Western world, particularly, I'm not going to talk about Asia and South America and so on, but the majority of the leaders of the Western world are globalist minded. They're young, they're a new generation coming in, and they've been trained, they've been educated in a system which has really been prepared by a globalist move. And so it's a definite tough situation. And I think sometimes we've even forgotten as a nation, we've sort of assessed the problems financially we've had and almost linked it with Brexit. when really we've forgotten that there was a pandemic. Followed by the Russian war. These were the major things that affected our lifestyle today and has affected the cost of your cup of coffee in the morning. And Brexit was, I believe, was my heart, was a right move for the nation. But I do know, I mean, there's no doubt that over the 30 years or 40 years or whatever it was since we got into the European Union, Europe became our main trade partner, whereas before that we were trading with Canada, we were trading with Australia, New Zealand, the Commonwealth countries were, and the USA. But suddenly everything we did had to be siphoned through this EU bloc, and therefore we lost some of our partnership or our trade agreements, and so it does take time to re-agree those agreements, those treaties you have with other nations. But I can see there's a huge amount of pressure pulling us into be back as part of a European Union which is bigger, more powerful than UK are on their own. And I don't agree with that at all. But certainly my prayers are towards a government that will stand up and see beyond what is on the table and see the benefits, and for our people too, that long term there will be benefits for us being independent, negotiating with other nations. But we need leaders. We need leaders and going in the right direction.
We're still finding ourselves, aren't we, to some degree beholden to EU legislation.
Yeah.
And so, we have had Brexit, but we're still under the European Court of Human Rights. We still have various regulations on our agricultural systems. So, what has Brexit given? In effect, I don't believe it's lived up to its promise. I don't think it's lived up to what we actually, those of us who feel it was a good thing and a right thing, it's not reflected what we voted for, really.
No, but also I think there's another indication with this that we need to discuss as well. And that is the fact that there's no vision coming from the Conservative Party regarding Brexit. So it was, for example, Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings had a clear vision of Brexit, that Brexit would mean that Britain would punch itself above its weight in terms of international affairs. The idea to create Britain as a kind of Singapore of the East, for being a low-tax economy, driven by entrepreneurship and taking the opportunities. But do you think also it's also because the Biden administration are refusing to give Britain a trade deal as well, that the Conservative Party under Jeremy Hunt and under Rishi Sunak have given up the idea of pursuing this vision of a free and independent nation because we can't get a trade deal with the States, so let's go to the EU and let's come up with a kind of Swiss-style model that will mean that we won't be in the EU, but effectively we will be in all but name.
Absolutely right. I mean, and I think this is also part of the globalist situation, because this the presidential government in USA are part of that move towards the globalist thinking. And so where we were thinking before that we could have an easier deal through Trump and the previous government in our nation, everything changed, and everything that was being handed over or offered suddenly came off the table of offer. So yeah, it puts the squeeze on UK and tries to push us more and more into being part of, firstly, the EU, and then secondly, or more importantly, final plan is part of this globalist move. And you can understand a government feeling the pressure for it, because we've been hit in so many ways, and our recent last couple of months of madness in our government and in the election system, and changing ministers and the cabinet and prime ministers almost as regularly as you have a breakfast, hasn't helped the situation. And then we look at what happened with Liz Truss. She the shortest ever prime minister in our
45 days, yeah.
Yeah, and she was talking independent structures and financial freedom and Singapore of the Western world. And how long did she last? The globalist pressure that came upon her. Yeah, maybe she was unwise in some of her policy making, speed of policy making. But anyone who talks against the move that the world's in is going to be taken into a great attack. So we need to be aware of that, certainly as intercessors, as prayer people, as believers, and be praying for those who are coming with a different agenda to the push that is coming from the world.
Yeah. And Reagan, I suppose one interesting aspect of this one is with Rishi Sunak as our Prime Minister, the change that, for example, the French President Macron has embraced him, and they've come up now with a £70 million plus deal to deal with the migrant crisis that wasn't on the tables before. So we're seeing a cosy relationship with there, and that the EU's relationship with Britain is freezing. I think the EU also saw that Britain leaving the EU posed an existential threat to the European project, and so they will be wary about closer ties with Britain and the EU. But essentially, we still have a civil service, don't we, that has a EU mindset, that still thinks it's in the EU, still wants to be in the EU, and therefore, even if our government, like our previous government under Boris, wanted to break away from that, they found that they were stifled in that because of the civil service. What's it going to take to change the mindset of the civil service and our government to really feel the benefits that Brexit gives our nation, and that's independence and sovereignty?
Simon, it's an amazing question to ask. I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer. Because it seems as if all of the arguments, all of the representation, all of the pros have been put out there at various points in various ways, and it's just not sunk in, partly because of the chaos of our government. And just think about it. We've had, since that referendum, how many different prime ministers? So we've just had 3 prime ministers this year. So yeah, it's madness. You can't have any stability. You can't promote anything unless you have core leadership that's staying, that's honest, that shows integrity. It didn't help that there were certain pledges that were made as regarding what Brexit could bring or would bring that were overinflated and overstated. There's been distrust. There's been breaches of integrity. COVID didn't assist things. We operated in line with what everyone else in the world was doing, even though it went against our own research, even though it went against our own pandemic planning going back, 10 plus years. So we found ourselves in this chaos, in this situation where we've not speedily been able to apply those things that would have led to a smooth Brexit. And so now what we have is this kind of chipping away and edging closer and closer back, because I think people are too quick to blame Brexit on the chaos. Time and time again I hear people say, oh, it's because of that Brexit. No, it's not because of Brexit. I mean, just the economic stuff, I find it ludicrous when I see the newspapers talking about the economic fallout and the recession that we're in being related to Brexit. It has nothing to do with Brexit. It has everything to do with keeping the country completely shut down in large sectors for over a year, wherein for almost 2 years you had people being funded to be at home. The furlough, that money was printed. It has nothing to do with Brexit. It was there. It has to be paid back. We're in a massive state of debt. And so what's the easy option? Just try to reestablish that relationship with Europe.
Absolutely.
So we need to get that relationship back, but I don't have the answer.
And I think we also have to just look back a couple of years and see the whole chaos that Europe was in during the COVID pandemic, and the way that they responded to that was very slow and cumbersome and what have you. And to think that, yes, we are facing an energy crisis, we are facing a cost of living, but is this not happening in France? Is this not the situation? It's far worse in Germany, where they are dependent upon Russian gas, and it's almost means that the lights almost turned out in Germany. They're going through difficult economic times, so you can't say that this is what's happening to our country is unique. Look what's happening in the United States across the Atlantic. I suppose this does pose the other question, really, is that it doesn't look like this Conservative government will last beyond 2024. Speculation that the Labour Party will win the next general election, and if they don't get a majority, could enter into a coalition with the Lib Dems. and they're federalists. They believe in the European Union and membership. So could we see, for example, a Labour administration giving the British people another referendum on our relationship with the EU and try and push us back into the EU, where essentially we'll have no sovereignty, we'll have no independent action, we won't be a free and independent nation, and also understanding that this European project doesn't stand still. It is designed to move towards a United States of Europe, to break down and destroy the nation state, so there'll no longer be a France, a Spain, an Italy, a Germany, because it will be one big European superstate. And why is that kind of argument, political argument, failing to resonate in people's hearts?
It's funny, I've always seen what happened in the USSR, United Soviet, whatever, Republic, how that broke down during the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and how, from the Western world we looked at it and said, well, it can never work because, there's division and all the rest. And then we're trying to do exactly the same in Western Europe. We're trying to unite nations, people from different characteristics. But there's no doubt that the pressure is on to go down that route. Somehow we seem to think because we are in Western philosophy, we can make things work that haven't worked in other situations. But we've seen in Russia too, even though it came down for a couple of decades, the pressure was immediately on there to revitalize or bring to life again the USSR, and that is Putin's dream and his plan and his schedule, his strategy. But yeah, bringing it back to our politics here, I'm pretty certain if the Labour Party do come in and they are even in a coalition government situation, there will be a desire to go back into another referendum, and Reagan touched on it earlier, that the previous referendum and the build-up to it, there were so many lies on either side. There were exaggerations and false promises there. And when those started to show themselves as unreal, the people became less inclined to be interested in politics and very cynical. I mean, I've said this before, people are very cynical about any government, whoever's leading. And the thing is, you just look at our Tory party, the Conservative Party, there's no unity there. It's almost a 50-50 juggle between be in or out, even though the vote eventually went for out. And I would say with the other side, the centre to left, it's probably 75-25 wanting to be in the European Union. They seem to think there's more power or more strength being united in that way. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if come 2024, if the Conservative Party haven't got their act together and things have changed radically, and it would need a radical change, because I think people just think it's time for a change, not even looking at the alternative. What's the alternative offering? It could be worse, but let's change anyway. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if very soon after the election there would be a move to get back into the European Union.
Yeah. Reagan, aren't we dealing with what the Bible describes as the Tower of Babel when it comes to the EU, a kind of spirit of Babylon, as it were, man's attempts to reach God on his own terms, and essentially this is what the EU is about. It's about creating a bloc that destroys the national institutions of any given nation that joins it. It destroys the traditions of that nation in order so it can be swallowed up into a big European superstate controlled by EU commissioners that no one elects, who have no accountability or legitimacy to lead the EU.
Yeah, I think you have to be concerned when a particular entity in some way, whether it's directly stated or in its symbolism, overtly takes inspiration from the Tower of Babel. You can see the construction of the EU building in Brussels. You've been there. Strasbourg. Yeah. You can see, it's modeled on that historic painting, and it gleans and takes inspiration from that. Babel was a project projecting humanism, essentially. We are one people. We are together. We're going to preserve ourselves. It's we're the power. We're going to show that we can ascend to heaven. It's the same language used concerning what Lucifer sought to do, to ascend to the heights. He sought to ascend and take the place of God. We have to be concerned with that. There definitely is across Europe that spirit of humanism, secularism, that we want God out of the equation. Okay, in some places you have a vestige of cultural Christianity that's looked on as a bit quirky, as a bit out of date, and it's going to die at some point. But at its core, I think you're onto something there. There is that spirit of Babel that is over the EU.
And Alistair, how do we pray about this situation? Because, we're not powerless, however kind of bleak our papers look, and giving the impression that our government no longer cares about Brexit, or not really committed to it, or only committed to it in name. And the fact is that we thought that our nation would be a free and independent nation. Shows that we are heading massively towards a kind of globalism under a globalist government with a globalist agenda, which ultimately means that we won't be a free and independent nation state determined to pursue our own foreign and domestic policy. So as Christians, how should we be praying into this situation where we know, in a sense, I know that a few of our people and some of our viewers will disagree, but I fundamentally believe that on that day in June in 2016, God gave us a historic opportunity that day to be free from the principalities and the powers of Europe, to pursue our own independence as a nation once again, and that God would maybe restore our nation. But
yeah, I mean, God is a God who answers prayer, and it's never over, and God's stirring up the hearts of many intercessors in our nation and in the nations of the earth. So it's not a case of let's give up and see what happens. And the thing is, it's an antichrist spirit. What Reagan's just been describing as an antichrist spirit, it's an anti-God spirit. It's man becoming God. And so 2 Chronicles 7 verse 4, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways. That's an important part that we try to ignore. The wicked ways it's talking to his own people. And we stand in the gap for our nations. He promises that he hears our prayers, he'll answer our prayers, he'll forgive our sins and heal the land. So it is so important for all of you out there, and myself included, that we pray in faith, knowing that our God hears and we are.
Alistair, Reagan, thank you so much for being my guest on this week's Politics Today, and I want to thank you for watching at home. We need to continue to pray for our government, pray for Brexit, that God would deliver our nation. So thank you for watching this week's Politics Today.